Jake Mitchell sorted through stacks of requisition forms, his nimble fingers organizing papers with an efficiency that seemed out of place for someone working in the battalion supply office. At 34, he had the focused gaze of a man who paid extraordinary attention to detail, though the soldiers at Fort Blackwater had no idea just how precisely that attention had once been calibrated. The small military base administration building was quiet most mornings, with only the occasional soldier dropping by to request equipment or fill out paperwork. Jake preferred it that way. He'd taken the job as a battalion clerk 3 years ago after drifting through several states, looking for somewhere that felt far enough from everything he'd left behind. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The soldiers knew him as the guy who showed up early, processed paperwork without errors, and went home without much conversation. What they didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Jake Mitchell had once been one of the Army's elite sniper instructors, with over a dozen deployments and a record that made him something of a legend in special operations circles. "Morning, Mitchell," called Staff Sergeant Melissa Rodriguez, the battalion operations NCO, as she walked past his desk. "Got those training request forms ready for the field exercise?" "Forms are complete and sorted by priority," he replied without looking up from his checklist. "Added the equipment annex and verified all serial numbers. Should give the commander everything he needs for approval." Rodriguez paused, watching him work. There was something about the way Jake handled paperwork that impressed her, a precision that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than just administrative training. He knew exactly which regulation to reference without looking, could spot discrepancies in equipment numbers at a glance, and had an uncanny ability to anticipate issues before they became problems. "You ever think about getting back into tactical training?" Rodriguez asked casually. "With your attention to detail, you'd probably make a good marksmanship instructor." Jake's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. "Training's not for me," he said quietly. "I'm better with paperwork and logistics." What Rodriguez didn't know, what nobody at Fort Blackwater knew, was that Jake had once been Staff Sergeant Jake Mitchell, senior sniper instructor at the Special Operations Target Interdiction Course, with over 10,000 hours of sniper training and 3 distinguished marksman deployments. He'd left the Army's elite sniper community in 2018, after losing 2 of his students in what the official report called a training accident due to unexpected weather conditions. The truth was more complicated, but the result was the same. 2 good soldiers dead, and their instructor alive to carry the weight of it. The sound of rifle fire in the distance made him look up instinctively, his trained ear analyzing the pattern of shots. It was the infantry company on the range, probably qualifying with their service rifles. The gunfire continued, and Jake felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came whenever he heard the distinctive crack of rifles firing at the distant range. "Must be nice to be out there shooting instead of pushing papers," Rodriguez commented, following his gaze. "Ranges are dangerous if not properly supervised," Jake said, turning back to his work. "Most NCOs don't have the training to spot potential safety issues before they become problems." His voice carried an authority that made Rodriguez look at him more closely. Sometimes when he talked about marksmanship, it was like listening to someone with years of experience speaking, not just a clerk who'd learned from manuals, but someone who'd lived it. Later that morning, a group of new sergeants from the scout platoon stopped by the supply office to requisition equipment for their upcoming sniper training. Jake was processing ammunition requests when he overheard their conversation. "That clerk over there," one of them said, loud enough for Jake to hear. "Word is he thinks he knows more about weapons than actual infantry guys." "Yeah, I heard. He's got opinions about everything," another added with a laugh. "Probably played too many video games or something." Sergeant First Class Victor Ramirez, who was leading the group, Glanced over at Jake. Something about his posture, the way he moved around the supply office with such quiet confidence, nagged at him. He'd been in the army long enough to recognize when someone carried themselves like they'd seen combat. "You know anything about his background?" Ramirez asked Rodriguez quietly. "Not much," Rodriguez admitted. "He showed up 3 years ago with perfect references and administrative skills that honestly make the rest of the clerks look like amateurs. Never talks about where he served before, though. Just says he did a few years and then moved to administration." Jake finished processing the ammunition request and began organizing the forms methodically, placing everything in its proper folder. The sergeants were still talking, their voices carrying across the office. "My buddy's an instructor at the sniper school," one of them was saying. "Says civilians and pogs who think they understand precision shooting are usually just keyboard warriors. They watch a few YouTube videos and think they're experts." The comment stung more than Jake wanted to admit. He'd spent years learning to ignore the assumptions people made about him, but hearing it from infantry sergeants, people who should understand the value of experience, brought back memories he tried to bury. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As he walked past the group toward the filing cabinet, he heard Ramirez say something that made him stop cold. "Easy on the clerk, guys. Something tells me there's more to his story than we know." Their eyes met briefly, and Jake saw recognition flickering there, not of who he was, but of what he might have been. Ramirez had the look of someone who'd served long enough to spot a fellow combat veteran, even one trying to blend into an administrative role. "Problem with your equipment request?" Jake asked evenly. "No, just making conversation," Ramirez replied. "You seem to know your way around weapon systems pretty well. It's my job to process equipment requests accurately. Where'd you learn about the difference between the M110 and SR-25 variants?" One of the younger sergeants asked. "I noticed you corrected our requisition form without even looking anything up." For a moment, Jake considered telling them the truth. He could see the curiosity in their faces, the professional respect that came when soldiers recognized competence. But the weight of his past, the responsibility he'd carried for 3 years, kept him silent. "You pick things up," he said instead, "when you pay attention." As the scout sergeants left with their approved paperwork, Jake returned to his desk, but Ramirez's words echoed in his mind. There's more to this story than we know. He was right, of course. There was so much more. The question was whether Fort Blackwater was ready to learn just how much their quiet battalion clerk had been hiding. That evening, alone in his small apartment near the base, Jake pulled out a worn ballistics manual and spread shooting data logs across his kitchen table. He still studied them every night, still kept his knowledge sharp, still maintained the mental calculations and formulas he'd never let himself forget. Because somewhere deep down, he knew that one day someone might need an instructor who could teach when nobody else could. He just hoped that when that day came, he'd be ready to remember who he used to be. The trouble started 3 weeks later when Sergeant Major Eric Davidson arrived at Fort Blackwater to oversee the new pre-deployment marksmanship program. Davidson was career infantry, the kind of senior NCO who believed in rigid hierarchies, and had little patience for support personnel who thought they understood combat operations. Colonel Harris had called a meeting to discuss the new arrangement, explaining that the battalion would be implementing an advanced marksmanship program to prepare for their upcoming deployment. Davidson sat at the head of the conference table, his uniform crisp and his expression skeptical as he reviewed the training records. "These qualification scores show room for improvement," Davidson said, though his tone suggested he'd found something to criticize. "Who's responsible for marksmanship training in this battalion?" "That would be Sergeant Jackson in operations," Colonel Harris replied. He's been our primary marksmanship trainer for the past year. Davidson's eyes scanned the room and found Jake in the back, still in his administrative uniform, having been called directly from the supply office to take notes on equipment requirements. The coffee stain on his uniform sleeve stood out starkly against the formal atmosphere of the meeting. "Mitchell," Davidson said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I've reviewed your personnel file. No specialized training in marksmanship, no sniper qualifications, just administrative experience according to your records." "That's correct, Sergeant Major," Jake replied evenly. "Well, that's going to be a problem." Davidson closed the folder with a sharp snap. "Advanced marksmanship training requires personnel with specific qualifications and combat experience. I can't have unqualified support staff making equipment recommendations for a critical pre-deployment program." Colonel Harris shifted uncomfortably. "Sergeant Major, Mitchell's work has been exemplary. He's maintained our equipment records perfectly and knows our weapon systems inside and out. I'm sure he's adequate for administrative tasks," Davidson interrupted. "But this is different. We're talking about preparing soldiers for combat operations. The consequences of inadequate training are measured in lives lost." He shook his head. "I'll need to bring in qualified combat instructors for all aspects of this program." Jake felt the familiar burn of injustice in his chest. He'd trained over 300 snipers for combat deployments, had developed curricula that were still being used at the Army's elite sniper schools, but without the paperwork to prove it, his experience meant nothing to someone like Davidson. "Permission to speak, Sergeant Major?" he asked quietly. Davidson looked surprised that he'd spoken up. "Go ahead. I understand your concerns about qualifications, but I've worked with these weapon systems extensively. If you'd like to review my knowledge of the equipment requirements." "Mitchell," Davidson's voice carried a condescending edge that made several people in the room wince. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but combat marksmanship is a completely different world from supply administration. The standards are higher, the techniques more complex, the stakes infinitely higher. No offense, but ordering rifle parts doesn't qualify you to understand how they're used in combat." The comment hit like a physical blow. Jake kept his expression neutral, but inside he was remembering the hundreds of training operations he'd overseen, the countless hours spent teaching wind estimation and bullet trajectory under variable conditions. He'd once trained a spotter sniper team that successfully engaged a target at 1,432 meters in shifting winds, a shot that required perfect communication and calculation. "I understand," he said simply. But Davidson wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'll need to establish clear boundaries about administrative personnel access to training operations. That means no unauthorized personnel at the ranges, no unsolicited technical advice, and absolutely no interference with our procedures." Colonel Harris looked uncomfortable. "Sergeant Major, this is still my battalion. Mitchell needs access to all areas to perform his supply duties. Then we'll need to coordinate schedules." Davidson replied curtly. "Training operations take precedence. If your clerk needs to access the range when we're using it, he'll have to wait." The meeting continued for another hour, with Davidson laying out increasingly restrictive rules that would make Jake's job nearly impossible. He couldn't inspect weapons during training periods, couldn't access ranges when marksmanship instructors were present, and couldn't offer technical opinions unless specifically requested, which Davidson made clear would never happen. After the meeting, Jake walked back to the supply office feeling like he'd been demoted in his own workplace. Ramirez, who'd been present as the scout platoon representative, caught up with him. "That was rough," he said quietly. "Davidson's got a reputation for being difficult." "It's fine," Jake replied, though his voice was tight. "I'll adjust." "You know," Ramirez said carefully, "the way you talked about ballistic coefficients and optics zeroing in there, it sounded like you had some real experience." More than just supply administration. Jake stopped walking and looked at him directly. Does it matter? According to the sergeant major, I'm just a clerk who processes paperwork. Sometimes the best people are the ones who don't advertise their qualifications, Ramirez said. I've learned to pay attention to what people can do, not what their paperwork says they can do. That evening, Jake sat in his apartment staring at his old military records, still sealed in their original envelope. His instructor certifications, commendations, shooting records, all the proof he'd need to show Davidson exactly how qualified he was. But opening that envelope meant opening everything else. The investigation reports, the casualty notifications, the reminder of why he'd walked away from teaching in the first place. He'd built a quiet life at Fort Blackwater, found peace in the simple work of processing paperwork without the weight of life or death decisions. Davidson's dismissal stung, but it was safer than the alternative. Better to be underestimated than to risk everything he'd worked to leave behind. The next morning, he arrived at work to find a memo posted on the supply office door. New training access protocols, administrative personnel. The list of restrictions was even longer than what Davidson had outlined in the meeting. He was effectively being pushed out of half his own workplace. Rodriguez found him reading the memo, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. I'm going to talk to the first sergeant. Don't, Jake said quietly. It's not worth the fight. But you're the best supply clerk we've ever had. They can, Jake interrupted, and they are. I'll work around it. But as he watched Davidson's team set up their equipment in the supply cage he'd maintained for 3 years, Jake felt something he hadn't experienced since leaving the sniper community, the desire to prove himself. Davidson had dismissed him based on assumptions and paperwork, but every instinct told him that eventually, the sergeant major's arrogance would create a situation where qualifications mattered less than ability. When that moment came, he'd be ready. 2 weeks into the new training program, Davidson's restrictions had turned Jake's work life into a maze of frustration. He'd arrive at dawn to find marksmanship instructors already occupying the supply area, forcing him to wait hours before he could access his own equipment. When he finally got to work, he'd be interrupted by sergeants who'd been told to monitor administrative activities around training equipment. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when Jake was performing routine maintenance checks on the battalion's weapon systems. He discovered a hairline crack in a rifle barrel, a potentially catastrophic failure that needed immediate attention. As he was documenting the problem and ordering replacement parts, a young sergeant approached him. "Mitchell, I need you to step away from the weapons," Sergeant Kevin Wells said, consulting his clipboard. "Sergeant Major Davidson wants all administrative inspection suspended while we conduct our training preparation." Jake looked up from his inspection report. "This rifle has a safety issue that needs to be addressed immediately. The company has training scheduled in 3 hours. I understand, but my orders are clear. No administrative activities during training preparation. How long will that be?" "Could be several hours, maybe all day." Jake felt his professional composure cracking. "So you're telling me to let soldiers fire a weapon with a cracked barrel because of a training schedule?" "I'm sure it's not that serious," Wells said, looking uncomfortable but holding his ground. "It is that serious." The sharpness in Jake's voice made several nearby soldiers turn to look. "I've seen what happens when rifle barrels fail. It's not theoretical, it's steel fragments blowing back into someone's face." Wells's radio crackled, and Davidson's voice came through clearly. "Wells, what's the situation over there?" "Administrative clerk is arguing about weapons inspection priorities, Sergeant Major," Wells responded. "Tell him to clear the area immediately. If he has concerns, he can file them through proper channels after our preparation is complete." Jake stared at the radio in disbelief. Through proper channels? While soldiers risked their lives with a damaged weapon. The disconnect between protocol and safety was exactly the kind of institutional thinking that had driven him away from the service in the first place. "You heard the sergeant major," Will said apologetically. "I need you to step back." "Fine," Jake said, his voice deadly quiet. "But when that barrel ruptures, remember this conversation." He walked away, but not before making a phone call to the company commander. "This is Mitchell at Battalion Supply. I need you to ground rifle number AT-789 until further notice. I discovered a critical safety issue that needs immediate attention." 20 minutes later, Davidson stormed into the supply office where Jake was organizing requisition forms. "What did you just do?" he demanded. "I protected soldiers from firing an unsafe weapon," Jake replied without looking up. "You interfered with training operations based on your unauthorized inspection of a weapon you were ordered to stay away from. I inspected it before your sergeant told me to stop." The safety issue was already documented. Davidson's face was red with anger. "Mitchell, you are deliberately undermining my training program. I've been more than patient with your attitude, but this stops now." "My attitude?" Jake finally looked up, and something in his eyes made Davidson take a step back. "My attitude is that weapon safety isn't a game. When I tell you a rifle is unsafe, it's because someone's life is at stake." "Don't lecture me about lives being at stake," Davidson snapped. "You're a battalion clerk with delusions of expertise. I've spent 20 years in combat arms, and I don't need some paper pusher telling me about weapon safety." The insult hung in the air like a physical presence. Several soldiers had gathered at the edges of the supply room, drawn by the raised voices. Jake saw Ramirez among them, his expression troubled. "Sergeant Ramirez," Davidson barked, then turning back to Jake, "I want you to understand something very clearly. You work for this battalion in an administrative capacity. Your opinions about marksmanship training are neither wanted nor needed. If you continue to interfere with our operations, I'll have you transferred to another unit entirely." "On what grounds?" Jake asked. "Disruption of training operations, insubordination, failure to respect the chain of command. Pick one." Davidson's smile was cold. "I have the authority to declare administrative personnel a liability if they demonstrate a pattern of disruptive behavior." The threat was clear: conform or lose his position entirely. Jake had seen this kind of power play before. Senior NCOs who used their authority to crush anyone who questioned their decisions. It was part of why he'd left the training community, the toxic culture that valued rank over competence. "We clear, Mitchell." "Crystal clear, Sergeant Major," Jake replied. But as Davidson walked away, Ramirez lingered behind. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine." "That crack you found in the barrel," Ramirez said. "You really think it was dangerous?" "I know it was dangerous. That barrel was one range session away from catastrophic failure." Ramirez nodded slowly. "You sound like you've seen failure analysis before." "I've seen enough weapons accidents to know the warning signs." "Where?" Jake looked at him for a long moment. Ramirez had kind eyes and the weathered face of someone who'd served in difficult places. He was asking not as a fellow soldier fishing for information, but as someone who genuinely wanted to understand. "Places where mistakes cost lives," he said finally. That afternoon, Colonel Harris called Jake into his office, his face grim as he gestured for him to sit down. "I got a call from Sergeant Major Davidson," he said. "He's lodged a formal complaint about your conduct. Says you're being insubordinate and interfering with training operations." "Did he mention the unsafe rifle I prevented from being fired?" "He says you're exaggerating safety concerns to justify defying orders." The colonel rubbed his temples. "Mitchell, I trust your judgment completely. You've never been wrong about an equipment issue. But Davidson has influence with the brigade command team. If he pushes this complaint, you could lose support for your command," Jake finished. I'll fight for you as much as I can, but I need you to be careful. Davidson's looking for reasons to get rid of you. That evening, Jake sat in his apartment staring at the envelope containing his military records. Ramirez's questions had stirred something in him, a recognition that maybe hiding his past wasn't protecting anyone anymore. Davidson was using a lack of visible credentials to undermine his credibility, putting soldiers at risk. He thought about the company that was safe because he'd refused to follow orders. He thought about the young soldiers who would be training with weapons that Davidson considered beyond his expertise to evaluate. Most of all, he thought about the students he'd lost in 2018, good people who died because someone in authority had made a decision based on ego rather than evidence. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. But first, he needed to be sure that Davidson's arrogance would create the opportunity he needed. Men like him always overreached eventually, and when they did, they usually endangered the people they were supposed to protect. Jake had learned patience in the military. He could wait for the right moment to reveal who he really was, and when that moment came, he'd make sure everyone understood exactly what Fort Blackwater had been hiding in their quiet battalion. Clerk. The crisis came on a gray Monday morning when the base weather turned dangerous without warning. A massive storm system had moved in overnight, bringing heavy rain and visibility down to less than a quarter mile. The National Weather Service had issued warnings for the entire region, but Davidson had refused to cancel the day's sniper qualification training. "Combat operations don't stop for weather," he'd announced during the morning briefing. "Our snipers need to be prepared for adverse conditions." Jake had been logging equipment issue forms when he heard radio chatter about the training exercise. Outside, through the supply room windows, he could see the soldiers struggling on the range, their spotting scopes fogging up as they tried to identify targets in the downpour. Davidson was standing beside the firing line with his radio, calling out instructions. "Looking good, Specialist Garcia." Davidson's voice crackled across the radio. "Try another position from the unstable platform. Use the rain to practice realistic conditions." Jake frowned. From his position, he could see that the unstable shooting platform was now completely waterlogged, creating a dangerous situation for any shooter trying to maintain position. Any instructor with actual sniper experience would know to avoid that platform in these conditions. He walked to the edge of the supply building and caught Ramirez's attention. "Sergeant," he called out, "that platform is unsafe in this weather. The supports are sinking into the mud." Ramirez looked uncertain. "I should probably tell the Sergeant Major, Sniper Team 3, you're cleared for qualification." Davidson's voice cut across the radio before Ramirez could move. Jake watched in growing alarm as Specialist Garcia and his spotter moved toward the unstable platform. The structure was visibly tilting to one side, and he could see the shooters struggling to set up their equipment as the wooden surface shifted beneath them. "They're going to slip and have a negligent discharge in about 10 seconds, he said to Ramirez, his voice tight with urgency. "Sergeant Major," Ramirez called out, "the clerk says the platform. The clerk needs to mind his own business." Davidson snapped without taking his eyes off the training area. As if on cue, the platform shifted exactly as Jake had predicted. Garcia lost his footing, and as he fell, his rifle swung wildly. Only the fact that his finger wasn't on the trigger prevented a potential disaster. But the expensive spotting scope crashed to the ground, shattering against the rocks. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Davidson shouted into his radio, but it was too late. The platform had collapsed completely, sending both soldiers sliding into the mud. Garcia managed to maintain control of his rifle, but the damage was done. The spotting scope was destroyed, and both soldiers were soaked and covered in mud. Emergency medical personnel rushed toward the soldiers while Davidson shouted for the training to be paused. The spotting scope, worth thousands of dollars, lay in pieces on the muddy ground, and the shooting platform was clearly unusable. The training exercise was effectively ruined. Davidson was already on his radio calling for a damage assessment and backup equipment, his face red with anger and embarrassment as he realized that his training exercise had just cost the battalion valuable equipment and training time. How did this happen? He demanded of anyone within earshot. Garcia, still wiping mud from his uniform, shook his head. The platform felt solid when we first set up, Sergeant Major, but then it just gave way. I didn't expect it to collapse. Like that. Why didn't anyone check the stability of the platforms in these weather conditions? Davidson demanded. I did mention the platform stability issue, Ramirez said carefully. The supply clerk tried to warn us about the shooting. Position. Davidson's eyes found Jake, who was standing near the supply building entrance. His expression was a mixture of fury and humiliation. You, he said, striding toward him. You knew this would happen. I tried to warn you, Jake replied calmly. Wet conditions compromise the stability of wooden platforms. That position put the soldiers and equipment at risk. And you didn't think to mention this earlier? I tried to mention it. You told me to mind my own business. Davidson's jaw worked silently for a moment. Around them, soldiers and officers were watching the confrontation with obvious discomfort. The collapsed platform and broken equipment sat on the range like physical evidence of his poor judgment. This is your fault, Davidson said finally. You had critical safety information and failed to provide it through proper channels. I provided it through the most direct channel available, Jake shot back. I told Sergeant Ramirez, who tried to tell you. You chose not to listen. You should have filed a formal safety advisory report. When you've banned me from accessing training communications, when you've restricted my access to the range, when you've made it clear that my opinions aren't welcome. Jake's voice was getting louder, 3 years of suppressed frustration finally breaking through. You can't have it both ways, Sergeant Major. Either I'm qualified to assess range conditions, or I'm not. But you don't get to blame me for following the restrictions you imposed. The crowd around them had grown larger. Colonel Harris was there, along with most of the battalion staff and several soldiers from the training unit. Even Garcia had joined the group, still wearing his muddy uniform and looking shaken from the near disaster. Sir, Garcia said quietly. To Jake, did you really predict that platform would collapse? Yes, Jake replied without breaking eye contact with Davidson. How? I've been shooting for 3 years, and I didn't see anything wrong with it until I was already falling. Because you've never been trained to look for the right warning signs, Jake said. Anyone who spent time as a sniper instructor would know that wooden platforms absorb moisture and become unstable in heavy rain conditions. And you have that experience? Garcia asked. Jake hesitated. This was the moment he'd been dreading and anticipating for 3 years. He could continue hiding behind his administrative identity, or he could finally reveal the truth about his background. The decision was made for him by Davidson's next words. He's a clerk, he said dismissively. He's never qualified as a sniper or taught anything more complex than how to fill out a requisition form. This is just administrative second-guessing based on zero practical experience. The insult was too much. Jake had watched Davidson's arrogance nearly cause a serious accident and destroy expensive equipment. He'd tried to prevent it and been ignored. Now the sergeant major was trying to blame him for his own failures while dismissing his expertise as irrelevant. You're right, Sergeant Major, he said quietly. I am just a clerk. I've never commanded a battalion or supervised large-scale training operations. I've never been responsible for unit readiness or equipment allocation. Davidson looked confused by what seemed like capitulation. But I have done one thing you haven't, Jake continued, his voice growing stronger. I've actually trained snipers at the highest levels. Multiple deployments, over 10,000 training hours, including developing the foul weather shooting program that's still being used at the Special Operations Target Interdiction course, where Weather patterns like this one are specifically identified as creating dangerous conditions for both personnel and equipment. The silence that followed was deafening. Davidson's face went through several color changes as the implications of Jake's statement sank in. Around them, soldiers and officers alike were staring at the man they'd known as a quiet battalion clerk. "That's impossible," Davidson said weakly. "Your personnel file shows no special operations experience." "My personnel file shows what I wanted it to show," Jake replied. "I came here to escape the training community, not to advertise my qualifications. But I never stopped being an instructor, Sergeant Major. I just stopped wearing the tab." Ramirez stepped forward, his face a mixture of amazement and respect. "Sir, what was your position?" "Senior Instructor," Jake said simply. "Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. I left the community in 2018 after losing 2 students in a training accident." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. The SALTIC program was legendary among military marksmen. Their instructors were considered the best in the world. Garcia removed his mud-covered boonie hat and looked at Jake with something approaching awe. "Sir, I had no idea. If I'd known who you were, I would have asked for your input on the platform stability." "You shouldn't have needed to know my credentials to listen to a safety warning," Jake replied. "Good judgment should be enough." Davidson was looking around desperately, realizing that his authority had just evaporated in front of his own troops. The man he'd been dismissing as an unqualified clerk was not only more experienced than him, he was more experienced than almost anyone in military marksmanship training. "This changes nothing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're still just an administrative clerk with no current training authority." "You're right," Jake agreed. "I'm still just a clerk. But now everyone knows that when I tell you a shooting position is unsafe or a weapon has a dangerous flaw, I'm not guessing." He turned and walked back toward the supply office, leaving Davidson standing beside his collapsed platform with the wreckage of his credibility scattered around him. The quiet clerk had finally shown his expertise, and nothing at Fort Blackwater would ever be the same. Word of Jake's revelation spread through the military community like wildfire. By evening, Ramirez had received 3 phone calls from former colleagues asking if it was true that the famous Staff Sergeant Mitchell was working as a battalion clerk in Fort Blackwater. By the next morning, Colonel Harris's office phone was ringing with inquiries from special operations units and training centers, who wanted to verify the story of the ghost instructor who had resurfaced. Jake tried to maintain his normal routine, arriving at dawn to perform his scheduled supply tasks, but the atmosphere at the battalion had changed completely. Soldiers who had previously ignored him now approached with respectful questions about marksmanship techniques and equipment selection. Even the officers were treating him differently, asking for his opinion on training plans and qualification standards. Davidson, meanwhile, had become increasingly isolated. The damage to the equipment and training schedule had triggered a formal investigation, and his superiors were asking pointed questions about why he had ignored safety warnings from qualified personnel. The preliminary report made clear that the incident was preventable and that Davidson had been specifically warned about the platform conditions, but had chosen to ignore the warning. "Sir," Ramirez appeared at Jake's desk around noon. "Could I speak with you privately?" They walked to a quiet corner of the supply room, away from the curiosity of other personnel. "I got a call from my former commander this morning," Ramirez said carefully. "There's going to be an official inquiry into yesterday's incident. They want to interview you as a witness." "I figured as much. The thing is, they also want to review your military records, the official ones, and when they do that," Jake prompted. "Sir, I did some checking. Your service record is impressive, more than impressive. You didn't just teach sniper skills. You developed some of the most advanced training programs in special operations, hostage rescue shooting protocols, night vision engagement techniques, extreme weather operations. Jake continued organizing the supply requisitions, not meeting Ramirez's eyes. That was a long time ago. 3 years isn't that long. And according to your records, you didn't just leave the sniper community. You requested immediate discharge from instructor duties after your students were killed. No transition period, no administrative cool down, just gone. What's your point, Sergeant? My point is that Sergeant Major Davidson isn't the only one who's going to be scrutinized by this investigation. When word gets out about who you really are, there are going to be questions about why an instructor with your qualifications is processing supply requests instead of training snipers. Jake finally looked up from his work. And you think that's a problem? I think it's a waste, Ramirez said honestly. We're short on qualified instructors, especially ones with your level of experience. The battalion could use someone like you. I'm not interested in returning to instructor duty. Then what about civilian consulting? Marksmanship program? Development? Equipment testing? There are lots of ways to use your skills without going back to full-time instruction. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Sergeant, do you know what happened to my students in 2018? I know they died in a training accident. I know it wasn't your fault. The investigation cleared you of any wrongdoing. The investigation was wrong. The words came out flat and emotionless. My students died because I made a decision based on incomplete information. I trusted my assessment of their abilities over my instincts about the weather conditions, and 2 good soldiers paid the price. Sir, training accidents happen. That's not on the instructor. Everything is on the instructor, Jake said sharply. When you're in charge of a training program, every decision is yours, every life is your responsibility. I made a choice that killed my students, and I've had to live with that for 3 years. Ramirez absorbed this quietly. Is that why you became a supply clerk? To make sure other people's equipment doesn't fail? I became a clerk because paperwork doesn't make life or death decisions. It either works or it doesn't. There's no gray area, no judgment calls that get people killed. But yesterday you made a judgment call. You warned us about the platform stability, and when we didn't listen, you took steps to protect the soldiers. That decision prevented injuries. That was different. How? Jake didn't have a good answer for that. The truth was that he'd acted on instinct yesterday, drawing on years of training and experience without thinking about the consequences. For a few minutes, he'd felt like an instructor again, responsible, competent, necessary. Look, Ramirez said gently, I'm not trying to push you back into teaching. But maybe it's time to stop hiding what you can do. Davidson's investigation is going to expose your background anyway. You might as well control how that story gets told. That afternoon, Colonel Harris approached Jake with a formal request. From the Training and Doctrine Command, the incident investigation had triggered a comprehensive review of battalion training procedures, and Tradoc wanted to interview all personnel with relevant expertise. They specifically asked for you, Harris said, handing him the paperwork. Apparently word has reached pretty high levels about your background. The investigator who called said you're one of only 8 people in the Army with your combination of advanced sniper instruction and combat deployment experience. Jake scanned the documents. The interview was scheduled for the following week, and it was clear that hiding his past was no longer an option. The investigation would examine every aspect of yesterday's incident, including Davidson's decision to ignore safety warnings from qualified personnel. Sir, he said slowly, what would happen if I told you I was thinking about getting current on my instructor certifications again? Harris's face lit up immediately. Are you serious? Because if you are, I know at least 3 training units that would hire you tomorrow. Advanced marksmanship instructors are incredibly rare, and with your special operations background. He shook his head in amazement. Mitchell, you could write your own ticket. I'm not making any decisions yet. I'm just thinking about it. That evening, Jake finally opened the envelope containing his military records. The document spread across his kitchen table, told the story of a decorated instructor with an exemplary service record. Commendations for excellence, perfect training evaluations, letters of recommendation from commanding officers, all of it building toward the final document that had ended his teaching career. The investigation report into the accident that killed his students was thorough and detailed. Unexpected weather conditions had created a visibility problem during a long-range shooting exercise, resulting in the students misjudging their target distance and walking into an area that had been designated as a possible impact zone. The report concluded that Staff Sergeant Mitchell had performed all safety briefings correctly, and that no instructor action could have prevented the accident. But Jake remembered those final moments differently. He remembered the subtle shift in wind direction that he'd dismissed as normal, the slight hesitation in the students' movements that he'd attributed to normal caution, warning signs that he'd overlooked because they didn't match what his experience was telling him would happen. Signs he should have acted on. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Garcia, the specialist from the shooting platform incident, looking more composed than he had after the accident. "Sir, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. Sergeant Ramirez gave me your address." "Is everything okay, Specialist?" "Yes, sir. I wanted to thank you personally for trying to warn us yesterday, and to apologize for not listening when you tried to help." Jake invited him in, quickly gathering up the military documents from his table. "You don't need to apologize. We're following orders." "With respect, sir, that's not good enough. I'm a sniper. My first responsibility is to the safety of my team and my equipment, not to following orders that put people at risk." Garcia looked around Jake's modest apartment, taking in the ballistics manuals and shooting data charts that lined the shelves. "Can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you tell us who you were from the beginning? If we'd known you were a SODIC instructor, everyone would have listened to you." "Because I didn't want to be an instructor anymore," Jake said simply. "I wanted to be a clerk who processed paperwork and minded his own business." "But you can't really leave it behind, can you? The knowledge, the instincts, they're still there." Garcia was right, and Jake knew it. Yesterday had proven that 3 years of administrative work hadn't dulled his training instincts or his ability to read dangerous situations. If anything, his time as a clerk had given him insights into equipment management that he'd never had. As a pure instructor, "Specialist, can I ask you something?" "Of course, sir." "If you had known about the platform stability yesterday, would you have made the same approach?" Garcia shook his head immediately. "No, sir, not even close. I would have requested a different shooting position or delayed qualification until conditions improved. Then the accident wasn't inevitable. It was preventable." "Yes, sir." "Completely preventable." Jake nodded slowly. "That's the difference between equipment failure and instructor error. Equipment failures happened despite our best efforts. Instructor errors happen because someone chose not to use available information." The conversation continued for another hour, with Garcia asking detailed questions about shooting techniques and position selection. It was clear that he was genuinely interested in learning from someone with superior experience, and Jake found himself enjoying the technical discussion. After Garcia left, Jake sat at his kitchen table, staring at his old training manuals. Ramirez and Garcia were both right. He couldn't really leave his instructor identity behind. The skills, the knowledge, the instinctive understanding of shooting conditions were all still there, sharper than ever after 3 years of intensive equipment management. The next morning, he made a phone call to the Training and Doctrine Command Office in Fort Benning. "I'd like to schedule a recertification assessment to reactivate my instructor status," he said when the administrative clerk answered. "Certainly. What type of instructor qualification?" Jake took a deep breath. Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Senior Instructor Level. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Sir, that requires Special Operations Certification and Advanced Qualifications. Can you provide documentation of your previous instructor status? I'll have the documentation ready, Jake said. My name is Staff Sergeant Jake Mitchell, formerly of the Special Operations Target Interdiction Course. Another pause, longer this time. Staff Sergeant Mitchell? I'll need to transfer you to our chief instructor, please hold. As he waited on hold, Jake realized he'd just taken the first step toward reclaiming the identity he'd tried to leave behind. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew that hiding was no longer an option. Davidson's investigation would expose his background anyway. Better to control that revelation and use it to prevent future accidents. When the chief instructor came on the line, his voice was respectful and slightly awed. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, we've heard about the situation at Fort Blackwater. I understand you prevented a serious accident by recognizing dangerous range conditions. I tried to prevent an accident, Jake corrected. Unfortunately, my warning wasn't heeded in time. Well, preventing what you could still matters. I'm told you also identified a cracked rifle barrel that could have caused injuries. That's correct. Staff Sergeant, I'd like to offer you expedited processing for your recertification. Instructors with your background and demonstrated judgment are exactly what our training programs need. When would you like to schedule your assessment? Jake looked out his window at the battalion headquarters where he'd spent 3 years hiding from his past. As soon as possible, he said. The Tradoc investigation team arrived at Fort Blackwater on Monday morning, led by Command Sergeant Major Patricia Rodriguez, a no-nonsense woman with 30 years of special operations experience. Word had already spread through official channels about the former SOTIC instructor working as a battalion clerk, and Rodriguez came prepared to uncover exactly how a preventable training incident had occurred, despite having world-class expertise available. Davidson met the investigation team at the battalion entrance, clearly hoping to control the narrative from the start. He'd spent the weekend preparing his defense, focusing on the unpredictability of weather conditions and the inherent risks of sniper training operations. Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez, he said with forced confidence, I want to assure you that this was an unfortunate accident caused by unusually severe weather conditions. We followed all standard protocols for range operations. Rodriguez consulted her tablet where she'd already reviewed preliminary reports. Sergeant Major Davidson, I understand you were specifically warned about platform stability by qualified personnel before the incident occurred. Can you walk me through your decision-making process? Well, there were some general concerns raised about weather, Davidson said carefully, but nothing that rose to the level of canceling essential training operations. General concerns? From what source? Davidson hesitated. An administrative employee made some comments about platform stability. This administrative employee, would that be Staff Sergeant Jake Mitchell, formerly the senior instructor at the Special Operations Target Interdiction Course? The blood drained from Davidson's face. Yes, that's correct. And you characterized his professional assessment of dangerous range conditions as general comments. At the time, I was unaware of his background. Rodriguez made a note on her tablet. Sergeant Major, are you telling me that you ignored safety warnings without bothering to verify the qualifications of the person providing them? Before Davidson could answer, Jake appeared at the supply office entrance. He was dressed in his usual administrative uniform, but he carried himself differently now, the confident posture of someone who no longer had to hide his expertise. Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez, I'm Jake Mitchell. I understand you wanted to interview me about yesterday's incident. Rodriguez looked up from her tablet and extended her hand. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, thank you for making yourself available. I've reviewed your service record. Quite impressive. Could you walk me through what happened from your perspective? Over the next hour, Jake provided a detailed account of the events leading up to the incident. Simplified military investigation text. Jake explained the bad weather that made the shooting area dangerous. He told them how he tried to warn the soldiers and how the chain of command failed to get his message to the shooters in time. "Do you think this could have been stopped?" Rodriguez asked. "Yes, completely," Jake said right away. The heavy rain made the wooden platform unsafe. Any good teacher would have seen the danger and changed the training plan. "Did you try to share this information?" "I warned Sergeant Ramirez about the platform problems. He tried to tell Sergeant Major Davidson, but Davidson ignored it." Rodriguez turned to Davidson, who looked very uncomfortable. "Is that true?" "You have to understand," Davidson said desperately. "This man kept interfering with our work. He gave advice even though he seemed to have no training. I didn't know he was former special operations." "Are you telling me," Rodriguez said coldly, "that you made training decisions about soldiers' safety without checking the background of someone giving safety advice?" He was introduced as an office clerk, a clerk who knew a lot about sniper work and range safety. "Didn't that make you want to ask more questions?" The questioning went on for 30 more minutes. Davidson's position got worse and worse. When Rodriguez talked to Specialist Garcia, the sniper's story matched Jake's exactly. Warnings were ignored, good advice was dismissed, and the accident happened because of bad leadership, not bad luck. "Specialist Garcia," Rodriguez asked, "if you knew about Staff Sergeant Mitchell's skills and got his opinion about the platform, would you have used that shooting position?" "No way," Garcia said quickly. "I would have asked for a different spot or waited until conditions got better." "You take advice from a sniper instructor seriously?" "Always." By Tuesday afternoon, word about the investigation reached Davidson's bosses. Command Sergeant Major William Foster came to Fort Blackwater to review the situation himself. Foster was a career special operations soldier who had been in many battles. He had no patience for the kind of pride that put soldiers in danger. "Eric," Foster said privately to Davidson, "explain how you ignored safety warnings from one of the best sniper instructors in the Army." "I didn't know who he was," Davidson said. "His file showed no special operations service." "So you didn't try to check his skills even though he clearly knew what he was talking about?" "He was hiding his background on purpose." Foster looked angry. "Eric, you're missing the point. Whether he was a former instructor or just a smart clerk, he gave you specific technical information about range safety. Your job as a senior leader is to look at that information, not dismiss it because of who said it." Ramirez knocked on the door and interrupted them. "Sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know, Staff Sergeant Mitchell just passed his teaching test. He's officially back as a Level 1 instructor." Foster looked interested. "How did he do?" According to the test team, it was the best they'd seen in 20 years. He made perfect shot groups, including some from hard positions that most instructors wouldn't try. After Ramirez left, Foster turned back to Davidson. "Eric, do you understand what happened here? You had access to world-class training skills, and not only failed to use it, you actively stopped it from being shared with soldiers under your command. That platform could have seriously hurt soldiers because of your ego." "I was following standard rules for—" "You were following your own bias," Foster interrupted. "And that bias almost hurt our people and destroyed expensive equipment. The early investigation shows this accident could have been completely prevented if you had just listened to good advice." Wednesday morning brought news Davidson feared. His bosses decided to start a formal inquiry into whether he was fit to lead. The investigation would look at not just this incident, but his overall pattern of making decisions during the training program. Meanwhile, Colonel Harris came to Jake with an unexpected offer. "I just talked to the commander of the advanced training unit," he said excitedly. "They're looking for someone to develop their new urban sniper program. When they heard about your background and what happened here this week, sir, I'm not sure I'm ready for that level of responsibility again. Mitchell, you've already proven you can handle the responsibility. You prevented a serious incident, protected soldiers from possible injury, and just passed the hardest instructor test the Army offers. The Army needs someone with your skills. That afternoon, Jake got a call from Rodriguez. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, I wanted to give you an unofficial update on our findings. The incident was clearly preventable, and Sergeant Major Davidson's failure to listen to safety warnings was a main cause. His decision-making showed a troubling pattern of dismissing good input based on personal bias. What happens next? That's up to the chain of command, but I think Sergeant Major Davidson's leadership role is basically over. His bosses are not happy with how this incident reflects on their training programs. Rodriguez paused. Staff Sergeant, I have to ask, are you planning to return to teaching? Because our training programs desperately need instructors with your skills. I'm thinking about it. Well, if you decide to do it, you have my personal recommendation. What you did this week, preventing accidents, keeping professional standards under pressure, showing exceptional skill under evaluation, that's exactly what the training community needs. Thursday evening, Davidson asked for a private meeting. With Jake, he found the sergeant major in the meeting room, looking tired and defeated. I owe you an apology, he said right away. I made assumptions about your skills and dismissed warnings that could have prevented a serious incident. That was wrong. Apology accepted. I also want you to know that I've recommended you for an award to both the training command and my commanding officer. Your actions this week showed exactly the kind of professional judgment the Army should aim for. Jake studied his face, seeing real regret there. Can I give you some advice? Please. Don't dismiss expertise just because it doesn't come with the rank or position you expect. Some of the best instructors I've known were low-ranking soldiers who started as equipment managers. Some of the worst were senior leaders who thought their rank made them experts. Davidson nodded slowly. I'll remember that, assuming I get the chance to use it. You'll get the chance, Jake said. This doesn't have to end your career, but it should change how you approach leadership. As Davidson left the room, Jake realized that the sergeant major's downfall wasn't really about punishment. It was about learning. The system was working the way it was supposed to, finding and fixing failures before they could cause more harm. Now, he had to decide whether he was ready to be part of that system again, or if he preferred the quieter satisfaction of keeping equipment running from the supply room. The formal military hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in the main conference room of the regional training headquarters. Foster had flown in from Fort Benning with a team of investigators, and the proceedings were being recorded for official review. Davidson sat at one end of the long table with his representative, while Jake sat in a chair near the window, technically present as a witness but knowing he was really the central figure in determining Davidson's future. This hearing will examine the command decisions that led to the preventable training incident at Fort Blackwater, Foster announced formally. We'll review Sergeant Major Davidson's response to safety warnings provided by qualified personnel. The first hour was devoted to technical testimony. Garcia described the weather conditions and the platform collapse. The training evaluator explained why the wooden platform was dangerous given the rain and soil conditions. Weather specialists confirmed that the conditions were predictable and within the scope of normal pre-mission planning. Then, Foster called Jake to provide his testimony. Account. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, Foster began. Please describe your interaction with training personnel regarding safety on the day of the incident. Jake had spent the previous evening preparing for this moment, organizing his thoughts and reviewing the sequence of events. He spoke clearly and precisely, outlining his assessment of the weather conditions, his attempts to communicate warnings through proper channels, and Davidson's explicit dismissal of his concerns. In your professional opinion, Foster asked. Was Sergeant Major Davidson's decision to proceed with the training exercise reasonable given the available information? No, Command Sergeant Major. The weather conditions created obvious hazards for shooting operations, particularly from elevated platforms. Any experienced instructor should have recognized the danger and either modified the training plan or delayed the exercise. And you attempted to communicate this assessment to training personnel. I specifically warned Sergeant Ramirez about the platform stability issues. He attempted to relay this information to Sergeant Major Davidson, who dismissed it without consideration. Foster made notes on his tablet, then looked directly at Davidson. Sergeant Major, you've heard Staff Sergeant Mitchell's testimony. Do you dispute any of the facts he's presented? Davidson's representative leaned over to whisper something, but Davidson waved him off. No, Command Sergeant Major, his account is accurate. Then help me understand your reasoning. Why did you dismiss safety warnings from personnel with apparent expertise in training operations? This was the moment Davidson had been dreading. The entire investigation had led to this simple question. Why had he ignored qualified advice that could have prevented the incident? Command Sergeant Major, at the time, I was unaware of Staff Sergeant Mitchell's special operations background. His personnel file indicated administrative employment with no instructor experience. I made the decision that administrative input on training operations was inappropriate. Sergeant Major, let me make sure I understand this correctly. You received specific technical information about safety hazards, and you dismissed this information without verification because you assumed the source lacked qualifications. Yes, Command Sergeant Major, that's essentially correct. Foster's expression was unreadable, but her next question carried the weight of command authority. Sergeant Major, are you familiar with the concept of the expert regardless of rank? Yes, Command Sergeant Major. Then you know that effective training. Safety depends on incorporating input from all available sources, regardless of rank or position. The principle exists specifically to prevent the kind of incident that occurred this week. I understand that now, Command Sergeant Major, do you? Because from where I sit, it appears you allowed personal bias to override professional judgment. You had access to critical safety information and chose to ignore it based on assumptions about the source. The room was silent except for the scratch of pens on paper as the court reporters documented every word. Davidson's face was pale, and Jake could see him struggling with the weight of his mistakes. Foster continued her interrogation for another 30 minutes, systematically dismantling every aspect of Davidson's decision-making process. She demonstrated how multiple opportunities existed for him to verify Jake's qualifications, how standard protocols required him to investigate potential safety hazards, and how his leadership philosophy had created an environment where crucial information couldn't flow upward. Sergeant Major Davidson, Foster said finally, do you believe you exercised appropriate leadership judgment in this incident? No, Command Sergeant Major. I failed to properly evaluate available information, and that failure endangered personnel under my supervision. And what, in your opinion, should be the consequences of that failure? Davidson's representative started to object, but Davidson stopped him again. Command Sergeant Major, I believe I should be relieved of leadership responsibility for training operations. My judgment in this incident was fundamentally flawed, and I can't be trusted with the safety of trainees. The admission hung in the air like a physical presence. Foster made more notes, then turned to Jake. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, you've heard Sergeant Major Davidson's testimony. Do you have any additional comments for this hearing? Jake had been dreading this moment as much as Davidson. He could destroy the Sergeant Major's career with a few carefully chosen words, or he could show the mercy that he'd never received after his own catastrophic mistake. Command Sergeant Major, I believe Sergeant Major Davidson made serious errors in judgment that endangered soldiers. However, I also believe those errors came from institutional thinking rather than malicious intent. He was operating within a system that prioritizes rank over expertise, and that system failed. Are you suggesting that Sergeant Major Davidson shouldn't be held accountable for his decisions? No, Command Sergeant Major. I'm suggesting that accountability should focus on preventing future incidents rather than simply punishing past mistakes. Sergeant Major Davidson now understands the consequences of dismissing qualified input. That understanding makes him potentially more valuable as a leader, not less. Foster looked surprised by Jake's response. You're recommending leniency for an NCO whose decisions could have injured fellow soldiers? I'm recommending that the Army learn from this incident rather than simply scapegoating the person who made the most visible mistake. The real problem isn't that Sergeant Major Davidson ignored my warnings. It's that the system made it acceptable for him to do so. The hearing continued for another hour, with additional testimony from Ramirez, Garcia, and several other witnesses, but the crucial moment had passed. Jake's unexpected defense of Davidson had shifted the focus from individual punishment to systemic reform. When Foster called for a recess, Davidson approached Jake in the hallway. "Why did you do that?" he asked quietly. "You could have ended my career." "Because ending your career wouldn't have prevented the next incident," Jake replied. "But maybe learning from this one will. I don't understand. After everything I put you through, why show mercy?" Jake looked out the window at the training range where soldiers were conducting routine marksmanship drills. "Because 3 years ago, I made a mistake that killed 2 people. The investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, but I knew better. I knew I should have trusted my instincts over my experience, and I didn't. That's not the same thing, isn't it? We both made leadership decisions that endangered lives. The difference is that your mistake was caught in time. Mine wasn't." Jake turned back to face him. "The question isn't whether we've made mistakes, Sergeant Major. The question is what we do with the knowledge those mistakes gave us." When the hearing reconvened, Foster announced the panel's findings. "Sergeant Major Davidson, this investigation has found serious deficiencies in your leadership judgment and decision-making process. However, it has also revealed systemic issues in how training operations interface with expertise from all sources." She paused to consult her notes. "Therefore, the panel recommends the following actions. You will be relieved of direct leadership responsibility for training operations, pending completion of advanced instructor development and organizational leadership training. You will serve as Assistant Operations NCO for 6 months while demonstrating improved judgment and leadership skills. And you will work with Staff Sergeant Mitchell to develop new protocols for incorporating expertise from all ranks into training." Operations. Davidson looked stunned. He'd expected to be relieved of duty entirely, possibly even reduced in rank. Instead, he was being given a chance to rebuild his career while learning from his mistakes. "Staff Sergeant Mitchell," Foster continued, "the panel recommends you for commendation for preventing personnel injuries and for demonstrating exceptional professional judgment under pressure. We also formally request that you consider returning to instructor duty in an advisory capacity, helping to develop the protocols that will prevent future incidents like this one." Jake nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Command Sergeant Major. I'll consider any opportunity to improve training safety." As the hearing concluded and participants began filing out of the room, Davidson approached Jake one final time. "I still don't understand why you defended me," he said. "Because someone once told me that the best instructors aren't the ones who never make mistakes," Jake replied. "They're the ones who learn from their mistakes and make sure those lessons protect other people." "Who told you that?" "My student, about a week before he died in the accident I could have prevented." Jake picked up his papers and headed toward the door. "The question now, Sergeant Major, is what you're going to do with this second chance you've been given." 6 months later, Fort Blackwater had become something of a legend in military training circles. The Joint Battalion training program that had nearly ended in disaster was now held up as a model for incorporating expertise from all sources, with protocols that Davidson and Jake had developed together being adopted at training centers across the country. Jake stood beside the new sniper training platform, built according to his specifications with adjustable supports and weather-resistant materials. He was running through his pre-training checklist with the methodical precision that had made him respected among local training units. He'd accepted the position as Battalion Marksmanship Coordinator 3 months earlier, after determining that he was finally ready to be responsible for training soldiers again, not as a full-time instructor, but as an advisor who could ensure that safety and quality standards were maintained across all training operations. "Sniper Team 6, you're cleared for qualification," came Davidson's voice through his radio. The sergeant major had been reassigned as training operations coordinator, overseeing both administrative and field activities at the expanded facility. "Roger that. Range is hot," Jake replied. "Conditions are optimal. Platform is secure." On the firing line, a new group of snipers was preparing for qualification, their movements confident and precise. Jake watched as Garcia, now a sergeant himself, guided his team through the proper shooting positions. This was what he'd always loved about instruction, the ability to share knowledge that would keep soldiers safe and effective, bringing them back home when the mission was done. The training development that afternoon required navigating complex administrative channels that would have been treacherous for most instructors, but felt routine to someone with his combined experience. As he observed the qualification course, Jake reflected on how much had changed since that morning 6 months ago when Davidson's arrogance had nearly caused a serious accident. Davidson himself had been true to his word, transforming from an imperious leader into a thoughtful supervisor who actively sought input from all ranks. His 6-month probationary period had ended with positive reviews from subordinates who praised his willingness to listen and his commitment to safety above ego. He'd been confirmed as the permanent training operations coordinator, with specific responsibility for developing leadership protocols across multiple battalions. "How's our new shooting team performing?" Jake asked Garcia as the qualification round ended. "Top scores across the board. Your platform design makes stabilization much easier in variable conditions. Training is all about controlling the variables you can, so you're prepared for the ones you can't," Jake replied. The range would teach that lesson one way or another. After completing his post-training checklist, Jake drove back to battalion headquarters to find Ramirez waiting for him. "Afternoon, Staff Sergeant," he said with a grin. "How was qualification?" "Smooth. All teams passed, 3 with distinguished scores. Wanted to update you on the latest statistics from the new training protocols. Since implementing the expertise recognition program, reportable incidents at training facilities are down 42% Army-wide." Jake smiled. "Turns out people have good ideas regardless of what rank they wear. Speaking of which, I have something for you." Ramirez handed him an official-looking envelope direct from the Department of the Army. Inside was a formal commendation from the Training and Doctrine Command, recognizing his contributions to training safety and organizational leadership. The letter praised his exceptional professional judgment, commitment to safety over protocol, and willingness to serve the greater good despite personal cost. "There's also an invitation to speak at the annual Sniper Symposium," Ramirez added. "They want you to present the case study on the Fort Blackwater incident. I'll think about it. You should do it. Your story needs to be heard." How many other qualified people are hiding in plain sight because the system doesn't know how to recognize expertise that doesn't come with the expected rank or position? Before Jake could respond, Davidson's voice came over the battalion radio. "Mitchell, we've got an emergency request from Brigade. They need an advanced marksmanship instructor for pre-deployment training. Regular instructor broke his leg. You available for immediate support?" "On my way," he replied, already moving toward the training center. As he gathered his materials and prepared to brief the deploying unit, Jake thought about the path that had led him here. 3 years ago, he'd come to Fort Blackwater trying to escape the responsibility of instructor duty. He'd wanted the simple satisfaction of processing paperwork without risking lives. But life had a way of finding people who were hiding from their true calling. The training center was bustling with activity as soldiers prepared for their upcoming deployment. This was the environment he'd avoided for so long, the place where his decisions directly impacted soldiers' readiness for combat. Yet now, with 3 years of perspective and healing, he felt the familiar confidence that came from knowing exactly what he and his students needed to accomplish together. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, deployment timeline is compressed, came the battalion commander's voice. We need to qualify 30 snipers in 10 days. Is that possible with current resources? Affirmative, sir. We'll adjust the training schedule to maximize range time while maintaining safety standards. I'll coordinate with Sergeant Major Davidson to ensure all equipment is prioritized. As he laid out the training plan for the deploying unit, Jake's radio crackled with a familiar voice. Mitchell, this is Davidson at range control. Weather forecast shows potential storm front moving in during day 3 of your qualification schedule. Do you need to adjust your training plan? It was a small gesture, but it represented how much had changed between them. 6 months ago, Davidson would never have consulted an instructor about weather impacts on training. Now he was actively monitoring conditions and offering schedule adjustments before problems arose. Appreciate the heads up, Sergeant Major. I'll front-load the distance shooting to days 1 and 2 and save the adverse condition training for when the weather turns. That storm will actually enhance our training objectives. Roger that. Your training plan, your call. We've learned that the hard way. Jake smiled at the reference to the protocols they developed together. Davidson had learned that true leadership meant protecting personnel by making smart decisions, not by demonstrating authority through rigid adherence to plans. The training operation took 3 days of intensive work, with Jake drawing on his years of experience to compress what would normally be a 2-week program into half the time, without sacrificing quality or safety. He found the deploying snipers eager to learn, especially when they discovered who would be conducting their training. The ghost instructor himself, one sergeant had whispered when Jake entered the classroom. I heard he could put 10 rounds through the same hole at 1,000 meters. Jake had dismissed the exaggeration with a laugh, but he'd also recognized the opportunity it presented. His reputation gave him the credibility to ensure these soldiers would listen when it mattered most, when he was teaching them the safety protocols that would keep them alive in combat. That evening, he sat in his apartment reviewing the day's training logs and updating his lesson plans for the next session. The routine was familiar and comforting, the careful attention to detail that kept training effective and brought soldiers home alive. A knock at his door interrupted his study. He opened it to find a young lieutenant nervously holding a folder of training materials. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, I'm Lieutenant Jessica Ryan, newly assigned to the battalion training team. Sergeant, Major Davidson said you might be willing to answer some questions about incorporating safety protocols into training operations. Jake invited her in, recognizing the eager expression of an officer who was genuinely interested in learning. Over the next 2 hours, he shared insights about range management, weather impact assessment, and emergency response procedures that couldn't be found in any manual. Sir, Ryan said as she prepared to leave, can I ask you something personal? Go ahead. Why did you leave active instruction with your qualifications and experience? You could have led any training program in the Army. Jake considered the question carefully. Because I needed to learn the difference between being an instructor and being a teacher. Sometimes the best way to serve is to step back and make sure you're serving for the right reasons. And are you serving for the right reasons now? I think so. When I was a full-time instructor, I taught because it was my job. Now I teach because soldiers need the knowledge, and I have the skills to provide it. The difference is subtle, but it matters. After Ryan left, Jake returned to his training materials, but his mind was on their conversation. He'd found his purpose again, not as someone trying to prove himself or advance his career, but as someone using his abilities to make a difference in his military community. A year later, Jake was featured in Army Times magazine with a story titled, "The Clerk Who Transformed Military Training." The article detailed how his confrontation with Davidson had led to comprehensive reforms in how expertise was recognized and integrated into training operations, potentially preventing hundreds of future accidents across all branches of service. But the recognition that meant the most to him was simpler: a handwritten note from Ramirez, now serving as an instructor at the Army's Advanced Marksmanship School, informing him that the safety protocols they'd developed were being taught to every new military instructor in the country. "Your willingness to speak up when others wouldn't listen has literally saved lives," Ramirez wrote. "Every instructor who learns these procedures will be safer, because you had the courage to challenge a system that wasn't working." Jake folded the letter and placed it in his range bag, next to the photos of his original students that he'd carried for 4 years. He'd never stopped missing them, but he'd finally found a way to honor their memory that didn't require hiding from his own abilities. Outside his window, he could hear the sound of rifles firing on the qualification range, their reports sharp and precise in the mountain air. Tomorrow he'd be back on the range, ready to share the knowledge that might make the difference between life and death for the soldiers under his guidance. He'd learned that true service wasn't about wearing the right rank or holding a particular position. It was about being ready to act when others needed help, using whatever skills and experience you possessed to make the military a little safer for everyone. The quiet clerk had found his calling again, not through ambition or recognition, but through the simple understanding that some responsibilities can't be hidden. They can only be embraced with wisdom earned through experience and mistakes. That had taught him the true value of listening, learning, and leading by example. In the end, that was enough. The impact of Jake's story reached far beyond Fort Blackwater. What began as a confrontation between a clerk and a sergeant major had evolved into a movement that was reshaping how the military identified and utilized expertise, regardless of rank or position. 6 months after the Army Times article, Jake found himself standing at the podium of the National Military Training Symposium, addressing an audience of senior leaders from all branches of service. The invitation had come directly from the Secretary of the Army, who had read about the Expertise Recognition Program and wanted Jake to share its principles with a wider audience. The most dangerous phrase in military training isn't enemy contact or ammunition shortage, Jake began, his voice steady despite the intimidating audience. That's not your lane. When we dismiss information based on the rank or position of the person providing it, we create blind spots that can cost lives. The room was silent as Jake shared the story of his journey from decorated instructor to anonymous clerk and back again. He didn't minimize his own mistakes or exaggerate Davidson's failures. Instead, he focused on the systemic issues that had allowed critical safety information to be ignored. "The solution isn't complicated," he continued. "We need to create a culture where expertise is valued regardless of where it comes from, where the question isn't, 'What's your rank?' but 'What do you know?' And most importantly, where admitting mistakes and learning from them is seen as a strength, not a weakness." In the audience, Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez nodded approvingly. She had been one of Jake's strongest advocates, implementing his recommendations across multiple training centers. Beside her sat Davidson, who had been invited to share his perspective on how leadership accountability had changed his approach to training management. When Jake finished his presentation, the questions came rapid fire from leaders eager to understand how they could implement similar programs in their own commands. But the question that stuck with him came from a young specialist sitting in the back row. Staff Sergeant Mitchell, what would you say to someone who has expertise but is afraid to speak up because of their rank? Jake considered the question. Carefully, I would tell them that true courage isn't just about facing enemy fire. Sometimes it's about having the strength to say, "This isn't safe," or "There's a better way," even when no one wants to hear it. Your rank doesn't determine your value. Your willingness to use what you know to protect others does. The specialist nodded, and Jake could see others around him taking notes. The message was getting through. After the symposium, Jake returned to Fort Blackwater with a new mission. The Secretary of the Army had authorized the creation of a pilot program called Subject Matter Expert Identification and Integration, SMEI, for short. Jake would lead the development team, working to create a system that could identify hidden expertise throughout the ranks and ensure it was properly utilized. The traditional career path assumes that expertise follows rank, Jake explained to his newly formed team during their first meeting. But the reality is that expertise follows experience and aptitude, which don't always align with rank structure. Our job is to bridge that gap. The team consisted of an unlikely mix of personnel administrative specialists who understood the personnel system, training developers who knew how to create effective programs, and combat veterans who recognized the life or death importance of the mission. What united them was their shared commitment to changing a system that had failed too many soldiers for too long. Their first challenge was finding a way to identify expertise that wasn't captured in official records. Jake knew from his own experience that many soldiers downplayed their skills or kept their knowledge hidden to avoid complications or additional duties. "We need to create an environment where people feel safe sharing what they know," said Specialist Emma Chun, the team's youngest member and a former competitive shooter who had insights into marksmanship that most career soldiers lacked. "And we need to ensure that when they do share, someone is actually listening," added Master Sergeant James Okonkwo, who had served in 5 combat deployments and seen firsthand the consequences of ignored expertise. Over the next 3 months, team developed a multifaceted approach. They created an anonymous skills database where soldiers could list specialized knowledge without fear of immediate additional duties. They established expertise roundtables where personnel of all ranks could share insights on specific topics without hierarchy constraints. And most importantly, they implemented a training safety protocol that required leaders to actively seek out and consider input from all available sources before making critical decisions. The results were immediate and dramatic. Within weeks, units participating in the pilot program were discovering expertise they never knew. They had a supply sergeant who had been a structural engineer in civilian life and could identify building weaknesses during urban operations, a cook who had grown up in the mountains of Afghanistan and could provide cultural insights no intelligence briefing could match, a mechanic who had specialized knowledge of improvised explosive device components from a previous deployment. But the program's true test came 6 months after its implementation, when Fort Blackwater was tasked with supporting a high-risk training operation for a Special Forces unit preparing for deployment. The exercise involved complex urban navigation, live-fire components, and simulated civilian presence, a combination that demanded perfect coordination and safety measures. Colonel Harris called Jake into his office the week before the exercise was scheduled to begin. "Mitchell, I need your assessment on this training plan," he said, sliding a folder across his desk. "The visiting unit has their own procedures, but I want to make sure we're not missing anything from our end. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us."